Yeltsin's reform and Russia political crisis in the 1990s. Join me for a free lecture from my online courses History of Soviet Russian in English. We will explore the collapse of Soviet state, Yeltsin's early reforms and their social impact, the political struggle in the 1990s, and key events that shaped post-Soviet Russia. If you want to understand how modern Russia emerged from the ruins of Soviet Union and how now we have Putin's autocratic states, please access the full courses with coupon in the description of this lecture. I will be happy to explain you everything about Soviet history. Russian Federation in the 1990s, the beginning of the 21st century. It's the topic of this lecture. Reforms of 1990s. Reforms of Gaidar, price liberalization, privatizations, political crisis of 1993, Constitution of Russia, Russian Federation 1993, reforms of government Chernomyrdin, default, and resignation of Yeltsin. In 1991, the Fifth Congress of People's Deputy of Russian Soviet Federal Socialistic Republic, Boris Yeltsin proclaimed a program of radical reforms with the aim of breaking the previous planned common administrative system. Given the importance and scale of the reforms, the president volunteered to head the government, requesting additional powers: the right to change the structure and composition of executive bodies with subsequent approval by the Supreme Soviet, and the issues of decrees that acquired the force of law if they were not challenged by the highest legislative body within a week. The Congress granted the additional power for a period of 1 year, until December 1st, 1992. In early November 1991, the government headed by Yeltsin himself was formed. The liberal economist Yegor Gaidar became vice-premier, responsible for the national economy. It was he who acted as the driving force and ideologist of radical economic reforms. Gaidar's reforms were characterized by the desire to liberalize economic life, establish free pricing and competition, unleash private initiative and individual responsibility, create a layer of owners, and establish a legal framework for entrepreneurship. The team of reformers proceeded from the facts that the objective laws of economics would in themselves lead to the creation of a market environment, retail and wholesale commodity markets, labor markets, and capital and financial services. The tasks were sought to integrate the country into the world economic space and to attract foreign investment. Russia accepted obligations to creditors for the payment of the debts of Soviet Union. The rush to carry out reforms was determined by the destruction of a food supply system. Even grain reserves were running out. The failure to fulfill contractual obligations by many economic entities, and most acute crisis of state finance and the balance of payments, and the growth of external debts. On January 2, 1992, prices were liberalized. The state stopped regulating prices for all goods, with the exception of bread, milk, alcohol, utilities, transport, energy, and precious metals. The accepted price increases are supposed to be compensated by increases in salaries, stipends, and social benefits. The presidential decree on freedom of trade was intended to activate market turnover, allowing anyone to trade without any permission. Only free trade in weapons, ammunition, explosives, toxics, and radioactive substances, drugs, and medicines were prohibited. The state monopoly on foreign trade disappeared. The restrictions on imports of goods from abroad were lifted. Foreign currency was allowed to circulate in the country. The radical economic reforms carried out by Gaidar's government were based on the Western theory of shock therapy. The reforms filled storage shelves with goods, eliminated queens, but was not enough money. Hyperinflation became a huge problem at the initial stage of reforms. Already in January 1992, prices had grown by more than 1,000%, and by the end of the year by 26 times. while the population's cash income had grown only by 12 times. All the people's long-term saving instantly depreciated, since there was no indexation of saving deposits. 44% of population found themselves below the poverty line. Retail turnover halved in a year. The budget policy of reducing the budget deficit led to a sharp reduction in spending on the social sphere: healthcare, education, science, culture, and benefit payments. The overwhelming majority of enterprises became unprofitable since state investments in them ceased. Prices for raw materials, energy, and transport increased many times over, and consumers' demand fell sharply. Mass mutual non-payment began. A complete collapse of industry was prevented by providing enterprises with preferential loans from the summer of 1992. But this added money to the economy and accelerated inflation even more. Hopes for financial assistance from the West did not come true. Russia's gross domestic products fell by 19% in 1992. For the first time since the early 1930s, unemployment returned. In 1992, an unprecedented economic experiment began on the privatization of state property. Privatization was carried out largely for ideological purposes to create a new class of owners. The State Property Committee of the Russian Federation, under the leadership of Chubais, proposed a privatization scheme under which workers, either free of charge or on preferential terms, acquired up to half of their shares of their own enterprises, or they could acquire a controlling stake, 51%, through closed subscription, and the remaining shares were put up or for open sale. In reality, everything came down to the fact that enterprises, mostly small ones, were transferred to the work collectives, and from them to directors and businesses associated with them. On August 14, 1992, a presidential decree on the introduction of a privatization voucher system in the Russian Federation was issued. From October 1, 1992, privatization vouchers with nominal value of 10,000 rubles began to be issued, which was defined as the share of each citizen of the Russian Federation in its poverty. The vouchers were to be exchanged for the remaining shares of enterprises that were freely available for sale, which means legally entry into the rights of the owner. But since effective mechanisms for investing vouchers in the economy were not developed, privatization brought only disappointment to the people. Despite its promises, the government did not ensure the exchanges of privatization vouchers for the mass of shares of Russian enterprises, and the market value of the vouchers turned out to be miserable. Privatizations created a lure of owners, but it did not create effective owners. Many immediately threw their staff out on the streets, sold equipment from their enterprises, and rented out the vacated premises. For most Russians, the reform meant rise in prices, a sharp decline in living standards, and increased social and wealth inequality. The state's withdrawal gave rise to a huge shadow economy. According to various estimates, the shadow economy produced between 25 and 40% of goods and services, mainly in the trade sector. The breakdown of many legal and moral norms, the weakness of state institutions, the redistribution of property, and the impoverishment of people led to a sharp rise in crime. People deemed the progress of economic reform unsatisfactory in the spring of 1992. Nevertheless, President Yeltsin defended Gaidar's government and only partial changes in its composition. By the end of the year, the conflict between the executive branch and legislators had become acute, after which Yeltsin chose to hand over the post of prime minister to Chernomyrdin. The confrontation between the authorities intensified, especially in the fall of 1993. Political crisis. During the development and adoption of a new constitution, the acute political crisis arose. The sense of a conflict between conservative and radical forces was that the part of a deputy corps headed by the chairman of Supreme Soviet of Russian Federation, Ruslan Khasbulatov, advocated the preservation of the existing state system of governance and opposite the radical economic reforms of Gaidar. On March 20, 1993, Boris Yeltsin, in television appearance, spoke in rather harsh terms about the actions of the Supreme Soviet and the Congress of People Deputies, which, in his opinion, hindered the continuation of reforms in the country. In response, the legislative branches convened an extraordinary Congress of People's Deputies and attempted to remove the President of the Russian Federation from office. However, impeachment failed. The President's opponents did not gain the required number of votes. It was then decided to hold an all-Russian referendum on April 25, 1993, to find out the attitude of the country's populations to the confrontation between the authorities. But none of the branches of powers received the support of voters as a result of the referendum. The conflict between the authorities became increasingly acute. The legislative and executive branches stopped cooperating. Each branch of the power prepared its own draft of a new constitution. According to the draft of the legislative branch, the position of the president became nominal, and the parliament retained strong control over the activities of the executive branch. This draft was blocked by the president's supporters and could not gain a constitutional majority. The presidential draft constitution envisaged a super-presidential republic and left no room for the Soviets and the Congress. This draft contradicted the position of a majority of People's Deputies and had no chance of being adopted by the Congress of People's Deputies. Thus, the country found itself in constitutional and legal impasse. In September 1993, the President of the Russian Federation, Yeltsin, took a number of radical steps to overcome the political crisis. In his address to the citizens of Russia, he substantiated the needs to liquidate the existing structure of the state administration system. In his opinion, the only way to overcome the paralysis of power was its radical renewal. With his decrees, he partially suspended the effect of the constitution of the Russian Federation. The Supreme Soviet of Russia qualified the action of Yeltsin as a coup d'etat. Some deputies declared his removal from power. A new president, Rudskoy, was sworn in. The leaders of irreconcilable opposition brought their armed supporters to the barricades. An unsuccessful attempt was made to storm the Major Office and the Ostankino television center. Several tens of thousands of people participated in the attempt to change the course of socio-economic reforms. A state of emergency was declared in the capital. The president brought troops into Moscow. The stronghold of the pro-opposition, the buildings of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation, was fired upon from the tanks and taken by storm. Constitution of Russia, 1993. On December 12, 1993, the Constitution of Russian Federation was adopted by popular vote. Russia was declared a democratic, a federal constitutional state with a republican form of government. The head of state was the president, elected by a popular vote. The bicameral structure of Federal Assembly, a permanent legislative body of the Russian Federation, consisting of a Federal Council and the State Duma, was legislatively enshrined. The jurisdiction of the highest bodies of power in Russia included the adoption of laws and control over their implementation, management of federal state property, principles of pricing policy, and the federal budget. They were responsible for deciding issues of foreign policy and international relations, declaring war and concluding peace, and managing foreign economic relations. The independence of the bodies of the three branches government, legislative, executive, and judicial, was emphasized. The political multi-party system, the right to freedom of labor, the right to private property were legislatively enshrined. The constitution created conditions for achieving a political stability in society. On the eve of first election to the State Duma, several political blocs and coalitions emerged. According to the electoral system reforms, elections were held under a mixed, majority and proportional system, and the voter turnout requirement necessary for the election to be recognized as valid was reduced 5% to enter parliament. As a result of the elections held on a multi-party system, multi-party basis, representatives of 8 parties entered parliament. The largest number of seats after the elections of the first parliament were received by choice of Russian, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, the Agrarian Party, and the Communist Party of Russian Federation. 450 deputies were elected to the State Duma of a second convocation. The overwhelming majority of them were employees of legislative and executive authorities. Many of them were members of the previous deputy corps. 36 of the total numbers of seats in the Duma were received by Communist Party, 12 by Our Home is Russian, 11% by a Liberal Democratic Party, 10% by Yevlinsky, Yabloko so-called party, Yevlinsky Boldarev Lukin, 17% by independents, and 14% by other electoral associations. Reforms of government Chernomyrdin. After the parliamentary election of 1993, Chernomyrdin, who retained the post of chairman of the government, went to meet public opinion and the opposition. He offered subsidies to the agro-industrial complex, eased the situation of debtor enterprises, and came up with a plan for integration of Russia and Belarus. Gaidar submitted a letter of resignation and Yeltsin accepted it. The government took a course on increasing the role of the state and regulating the economy, taking into account the interest of industry, especially its extractive industries, which produced the bulk of export products and were the main sources of foreign exchange earnings. The economy continued to decline. In 1994, gross domestic products fell by 12%. In 1993, prices rose by 440%, and in 1994 by 215%. The tax system in conditions of a market economy was still only just taking shape. Tax rates were unjustifiably high, which in itself created an incentive for enterprises to go underground. In 1990s, the volume of production investments fell by 80%. In 1994, the first time in the country's history, the share of a service sector in gross domestic product exceeded half. But this did not indicate a transition to a post-industrial economy, but rather rapid deindustrialization. Defense and all other knowledge-intensive industries were closed. In 1992-1993, two-thirds of the 25,000 collective and state farms were transformed into cooperative, joint stock and private enterprises. Since 1993, land has been equated to any other real estate, which could be bought, sold, given away or leased. Agricultural production fell sharply. Newly emerging farmers did not have money for equipment, fertilizer or seeds. The domestic market was quickly filled with foreign food, often of dubious quality. Numerous financial pyramids appeared in the country: MMM, Hopper Invest. Privatization in the form in which it was carried out damaged the country's economy. Firstly, assets went to new owners and symbolic prices. Secondly, the low price of entry into the market determined the focus on immediately profit and inattention to the strategic goals of enterprise development. Thirdly, it became pointless to build new production facilities, since their cost could not compete with the companies being privatized for next to nothing. Fourthly, allowing only our own to participate in privatization limited the influx of foreign capital into the Russian market. At the same time, privatization allowed the stock market to develop and create a layer of large entrepreneurs. There were cardinal changes in the ownership structure. By 1998, 12% of enterprises were in state ownership, 73% were private, 8% were in mixed ownership, and 5% were in the ownership of public organizations. The instability of domestic political life was also expressed in inter-ethnic relations. One of the hotbeds of conflict was the North Caucasus. Only with the help of Russian arms was it possible to stop armed clashes between the Ingush and Ossetians that arose due to the territorial disputes. The development of a separatist movement in the Chechnya Republic led to the armed conflicts with the official authorities. In December 1994, the Russian armed forces were brought into Chechnya. This marked the beginning of the First Chechnya War, which ended with the sign of a peace agreement in November 1996, the withdrawal of federal armed forces from the republic and the holding of presidential election in it. After winning the 1996 presidential election, Yeltsin undertook a second round of liberal reforms. Social spending was cut, new loans in euro bonds and government short-term bonds were placed to cover the budget deficit, and privatization was completed through collateral auctions. A monetary reform took place. From January 1, 1998, the ruble was denominated 1,000 times. In the condition of falling stock market, a sharp decline in world energy prices and losses of Russian energy companies, budget revenues began to decrease. Salary arrears began to rapidly clear up. The pension fund was on the verge of bankruptcy. In March 1998, a third attempt at liberal reform followed. Chernomyrdin and Chubais were dismissed, and Kiriyenko was appointed acting chairman of the government of Russia. Default. On August 17, 1998, the default occurred. The government announced its inability to service the national debt. Banks, companies, and individuals lost huge amounts of money. The value of the ruble against the dollar instantly fell threefold. The population rushed to buy dollars and withdraw deposits from banks. Inflation in 1998 jumped to 84%. Only with the arrival of government Primakov did the economic crisis, unprecedented in the modern world in terms of scale and duration of decline, end. The government of Primakov, which declared active support for domestic industry and agriculture, managed to stabilize the situation in the economy. Income tax rates and taxation of production investment were reduced, mandatory sale of 75% of foreign exchanges, earnings on the stock exchange by exporters were introduced, and customs control was tightened. The reduction in imports caused by the depreciation of the ruble after the default and the reduction in production cost of domestic exporters contributed to the revival of industry. In 1999, economic growth resumed by 3%, and inflation fell to 36%. The frequent change of prime minister in 1999 was also connected with the decision of who would lead the country after the expiration of Yeltsin's presidential term and who could become his successor. On August 9, 1999, Yeltsin appointed the head of the Federal Security Service, Vladimir Putin, as acting chairman of the government. On August 16, his candidacy was approved by the State Duma. On January 1, 1999, President Yeltsin announced his resignation during his New Year address to the citizens of Russia. Vladimir Putin became acting president according to the constitution. Thus started his